Hello everyone. In the last video, we discussed about the difference between arrow functions and normal functions when it comes to the value of this. Now in this video, we will be exploring some examples involving callbacks to see how the value of this is determined in different scenarios. We will not be discussing any new idea in this video, but I feel like these examples need a special attention because sometimes these can be confusing. Let's start by this example. Here, we know that when we call user.greet, the value of this inside the greet function will be user because the object associated with this function call is user. You can see that hello John is printed. Now let's create a higher order function, and then we can use that higher order function to invoke the greet function of this user object. So this is a simple function which receives a callback and it just executes the callback. Now we can call caller by passing user.greet. Now what do you think? What happens here? You can see that here we are extracting the value of the greet field from user, which means here we are passing the function value. So when we pass the function value, the association with the object is not being passed. So when it reaches here, this is just a normal function. So the caller function gets the function value, and inside it just invokes the function in the normal way. So what happens? This function will be executed. Now value of this will be undefined. This is in strict mode. So inside this function, the value of this will be undefined, and we are trying to access name field of undefined, so it will throw an error. Cannot read properties of undefined. Now, what are the different ways that we can fix this? Which means when we pass user.greet and when caller invokes the function, the value of this inside that function should be user. So one way is when we pass user.greet, we can just use the bind method. Bind, and the first argument of bind should be the value of this. Now we can simply pass user. Now here user.greet.bind creates a new function, and the new function is being passed to caller. Okay. Now you can see that hello John is printed. What is another way? So another way would be, instead of directly passing, let's create another function here, a wrapper function, and inside we can simply call user.greet. Okay, so this way we are not giving user.greet to the caller, we are giving this anonymous function. Now what the caller does, it receives the function and just invokes it, and inside this function body, here we are directly calling user.greet. Now the function call is associated with the user object, so the value of this will be user object. Now save this. Again we get hello John. So in this scenario, we have to focus on two things: what value we passed as the callback, and inside the higher order function, how that callback is invoked. Okay. Now in the first scenario, we directly passed user.greet. Now it is passed as a normal function, and inside the caller function, it is executing as a normal function. Now in the second case, we use the bind method. So then we explicitly modified the value of this inside the function. So we passed a new function returned from the bind function. And here we created a wrapper function, and inside the function body, we are directly calling user.greet. Okay, so what value we actually passed. Now, how this is invoked is also important. Okay, so here it is just receiving the callback function and it is invoking the received function. But let's say we can modify this. So inside this function, I have defined another user object. And inside this user object, the name field is Shweta. And whatever function this caller receives, it is using the call method and it explicitly modify the value of this with this user object. So now how the function is invoked got changed. Okay. Now again, we can use caller and we can just pass user.greet. Okay. So again, we are extracting the function value. So a normal function is passed, but inside this caller, it is not invoking in the normal way. It is using the call method and using this user object as the value of this. Now what happens? So this function will be received here in this fn parameter, and inside this function, the value of this will be this object. So it will print hello Shweta. Hello Shweta. Now let me change this to user.greet.bind and user. Okay. Now we are not directly passing user.greet. So we are passing the returned function from the bind method, and here we explicitly modified the value of this as the outer user. Now what happens? So this is already a bound method, and we know that we cannot change the value of this again. So even though inside this caller we are using call and using this user object, the original value of this is not modified because we already used this user object as the value of this. Now save this. This time we get hello John. We won't get hello Shweta. So that's what I was saying. We have to focus on two things. What value we passed and how the function is invoked. Okay. Now think about this. What if the caller function is an external function? So in this example, we defined the caller and we defined this user object and greet function. So we know how all this works. Consider that we are using an external function from a third-party library or an existing API which expects a callback to be passed. But we don't know how it uses the callback internally, which means we don't know how the function is invoked. Is it using explicit binding internally or is it being called normally? So we don't know that. But here we know it because we defined the higher order function and we know that how it internally uses the passed function. Okay, so let's take another example. So here I'm using setTimeout. Okay, and I'm passing user.greet as the callback function. And after 1 second, this user.greet will be executed. Now we are not invoking the function. The setTimeout internally invokes the passed function. We don't know how it internally calls this function. Does it call normally or does it use explicit binding? We don't know. Now let's check this. I'm going to save this. So we just get hello, nothing else. Okay, but we didn't get an error. So what happens here is that since we are passing a normal function, which means we are extracting the function value and it is a normal function, and we know that internally that function will be called, and when a normal function is invoked and if it is using this inside in strict mode, the value of this will be undefined. So we expect an error, but we didn't get an error. So it just print hello and this is an empty string, which means Here, this is not undefined. If it was undefined, we would get an error. So if the value of this is not undefined, means that inside setTimeout, it is not just invoking the received function normally. It might be using explicit binding, something like callback dot call, and it is passing some object. So the value of this will be this object, and its name field will be empty. That's why it's just print hello, and this was empty, right? So here we can change this to just this to see the value of this. Save this. So once after 1 second, it printed hello and the object. Now the object is the window object, which means the global object in the browser environment. So what it says that internally the setTimeout uses explicit binding and it passes the value of this as window or global this. So that is why even though we passed a normal function, we didn't get this as undefined. So in a normal function, and if it is executed normally, the value of this will be undefined in the strict mode. But we don't know how internally the setTimeout function invokes the received callback, right? So from the output, now we know that it uses explicit binding and it passes the window object when it invokes. Now let me change this user.greet to an arrow function. And inside this arrow function, let's try to print the value of this. Okay. Now save this. What will be the expectation? So here we are passing an arrow function, and even if it uses explicit binding internally, we know that since arrow function does not have its own this value, we cannot modify it. So the value of this will be from outside. So in this particular case, the lexical environment is the global environment. So again, the value of this will be window in this case. It is not because the setTimeout internally uses explicit binding to change the value of this. Now let's save this and check. Again, we get window object. Let me do one more thing. Let me wrap this into uh, another function. Uh, Let me use immediately invoked function expression. So here I'm going to cut this and put it inside this function. Now, okay, now this setTimeout function call is inside this anonymous function, right? And what happens here? Again, the arrow function is created, and this time the value of this is again the lexical this. And this time, the lexical environment is not the global environment, but this anonymous function. And since this is a function keyword function, the value of this inside will be undefined. So again, this here will be undefined. Now let's save this and see the output. You can see undefined is printed because in this scenario, the lexical this is undefined. Even though internally it uses explicit binding and passing global this, we won't get that because this is an arrow function. And again, to the previous example, set timeout and user.greet, and 1 second. Now this time we know that the value of this will be window, but what if we use bind here and here we can just pass user? So we are not passing a normal function here. We are passing a bound function and the value of this inside will be user. So internally, even if the setTimeout uses explicit binding to change the value of this, since this is a bound function, it won't work. So let's save this. And this time you can see we didn't get the window object, but we got the user object. Let's check another example. So here we are using the forEach method of the array instance. So we have three elements in this array, and the passed callback will be executed 3 times. And what we are doing here, this is a function keyword function, and inside we are trying to access the value of this. Okay, now let's save this and see what is the value. You can see that undefined is printed 3 times. Now again, this is a normal function, and if it is executed normally, the value of this inside will be undefined. So from this, we know that internally forEach is not using explicit binding, which means whatever callback it receives internally, it just does this callback, and it just passes the current value and the index and the array. So this is what happens internally. It is not using explicit binding. So that's why the value of this is undefined. So here people will have a confusion that we are invoking it as a method of this array instance, right? So we would think that should the value of this be the array instance, because we are invoking it as a method. So this is a property reference. So shouldn't the value of this be this array instance? No. So if you clearly look at this, we are invoking for each, and inside the for each, the value of this will be this array instance. And here, this is a normal function that we are passing to for each. And this function is not connected to any object. And internally, this function is normally executed. There is no association with an object. So that is why the value of this is undefined. Now, all these array methods have another argument. So here we just passed the callback function. That's the first argument. Now we can pass a second argument. And the second argument is the value of this, just like explicit binding. So if you just pass user object here, then what it does is that internally it won't just do like callback like this. Instead, it uses the call method and uses the passed object. So in this case, user. Then the other values, the current value, the index, and the array. Okay, so let's see. Now we are passing user. Save this. You can see the user object is printed 3 times. Okay, is there any other way without this second argument we can achieve the same thing? So what we can simply do is that we can just do bind, and we can simply pass user. Now what we are passing is a bound function. Save this. Again, we get the user object printed 3 times. Let's check one more example. Here we will be looking at the add event listener function. So in my document, I added a div with the class container and inside a button, and I just added some basic styling. Now if you see the UI, so we have this container, and inside the container we have a button, click me. Okay, now what we are going to do is that we will add an event listener to this container. So we can just remove this. So we get the container in this variable, and container dot add event listener, and here we can give the click event, and we can pass the callback function. Now just do this. Okay, so what happens here is that when we click on this container or this button, this function will be executed. And here again, we are passing a callback function to the add event listener function. We don't know how internally this function is executed. Okay, so if this function is executed normally, the value of this will be undefined because this is strict mode, right? But we don't know that. So let's check this. Now the console is empty. I'm going to click here. So you get the element, right? The div element where we attached the event listener. So since we clicked not the button but the div, the event.target is also this. Let me click the button this time. Again, we got the same element as the value of this. Okay, so from this, what we have to understand is internally, this callback is not executed normally. Internally, it uses explicit binding and it uses the element as the value of this where we added the event listener. So in this case, we added to this container, right? So the value of this inside this function will be container. And there should be any confusion here. You can see that we are calling the add event listener using an object. So obviously, inside this event listener, the value of this will be this container. But that doesn't mean that inside this function, the value of this is container if it is executed normally. This is a separate function. Okay, so what we can say that internally in this add event listener function, it receives this callback, okay, and it uses this call method, and then we should pass the value of this, okay. And what will be the value of this inside this? I mean, if it just passes this, the container only, because inside add event listener, the value of this will be the object that it is used to invoke the function, right? So in this way, callback.call this inside the add event listener will be the element. Okay, so is there any other way we can access the element without using this? So we get event here, right? So when it calls the function internally, it passes the event object. The value of this actually is event dot current target. Okay, so let's print event dot target as well. Okay, so we are printing three values: this, event dot current target, and event dot target. So what is event dot current target? Event dot current target gives you the element where we added the event listener. And what is event dot target? It gives you the element where the actual event happened. So in this scenario, there is two places that the event could happen: the container element and the button element. Okay. Now the value of this will be always event dot current target. Let me save this. So the console is empty. Now I'm going to click inside the div, but not the button. So I'm clicked here. So this is the value of this, which is the container element. And this is the value of event.current target, which is again the container element. And the last one is the event.target. So you can see that we attached the event listener to this div. So that's why the current target gives you this container element. And we clicked on the element only. So event.target is also the container element. Now let me clear this and I'm going to click to the button. So this time the value of this is again the element where we added the event listener, which is event.current target, so the same element, but event.target is the button where the actual click happened. Okay, which means when we pass a normal function, which means a function keyword function to add event listener, the value of this will be event.current target. So simply we can do this is the value of this equal to event.current target. Save this. Now we can click here again, we get true. Okay. Now what happens if you change this to an arrow function? Okay. Now we are passing an arrow function. Now again, if even if it uses explicit binding internally inside add event listener, here it's an arrow function. Since arrow function does not have its own this, we cannot use explicit binding to this. Okay. Now let's save this, and this time we get false. Okay. Let's check the value of this in this case. So this and event dot current target. So what will be the value of this? So the value of this will be the value of this in the outer environment. So the outer environment is the global environment. So the value of this will be window in this case. And event dot current target will give you the element where the event listener is added, which is the container element. Now again, click here. So you get window as the value of this inside the arrow function, and the container element as the value of event dot current target. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have any confusions, please try to rewatch it and make sure to watch the previous videos in the series. And you don't have to memorize any of this. Try to understand the concept and use it accordingly. Thank you for watching.